Thank you, Samantha, and the readers, everyone who contributed to the opening and to service to this meeting. What a great group of people. Great to see smiling faces and to see so many friends and so many heroes on this line tonight. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about Step 11 and how it impacts my life. And I love that little line. You know, it just seems so appropriate, you know, and it perhaps the real trouble was our almost total inability to point imagination right out. Our imagination. I got to tell you, I had no problem using my imagination. I had no problem activating my imagination. I had no problem almost being subject to my imagination. As a matter of fact, I think when I joined Alcoholics Anonymous, and probably for years before that, there was almost nothing in my life that was not based in imagination. I mean, I lived in a fantasy world. There's just no question about it. Dr. Silkworth says in the doctor's opinion that I have an inability to differentiate the truth from the false. And what that means to me is that false things look true to me and true things look false to me. And I don't even know I'm seeing them that way. My imagination is telling me stories and I'm just drinking the Kool-Aid. Whatever it says must be true. I'm real sure you couldn't help me. I'm real sure you don't like me. I'm real sure I better take from you or I'm not going to get. I'm real sure I better manipulate you or you're not going to be compliant. There's no way a rational conversation can bear any good fruit, so I have to scream. There's really no evidence at all that you'll love me if I show you who I actually am. So I'm going to be the actor who wants to run the whole show, who's forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and all the rest of the players so I can get my own way. Because I know that if I don't manipulate you into getting me what I want, I'm a dead man. Now, I got to tell you, I didn't grow up in a home that told me that. I truthfully grew up in a home that told me the exact opposite. If I had a conversation with my family about life, it was generally came down to some pretty key and simple principles that frankly I didn't really even know how to practice until I met my first sponsor. But they were introduced to me when I was a little boy. And those are things like just prayer and being calm and being kind to people and trying to serve so that other people's needs can get met. And you'll feel fulfilled, Mike, when you service and aid others in getting their needs met. Now, that's what I was told. But my imagination, my own head, painted a completely different picture. Completely different picture. Now, there's probably reasons for that, right? But it's true. And I can tell you, I can go through each one of the steps and I can tell you how my imagination painted one picture that was completely not true, only after having worked the step to discover what was true, and I had no concept that they were even close. And that's especially true in the 11th step. Once I worked steps 4 through 9 to try to complete this decision I made in 3, to try to give my will and my life over to the care of a God that I sort of discovered and came to believe could restore me to sanity in step 2. After damn near killing myself in step 1, trying to get to that place, I discovered something in the 11th step. And that is that what I really lacked was power. Now, I had read that in earlier steps, but I didn't really understand it. I didn't really understand it. What I've come to see is that I was subject to every thought that ran through my head uniquely. I lived by this rule. If I think it, it must be true, even if it wasn't. And I ran around the world, basing my life on thoughts I had, whether or not they were true or false, without any semblance of sanity. striving to try to get my needs met, and stepping on the toes of my fellows constant. By the time some of these things began to appear false to me, another way to say those things that were false actually appeared false might be this: I began to see some truth, right? Began to see some truth in step 9. The things like restitution, things like commitment, things like paying back the things I had stolen would actually grant me the very things I was looking for to begin with. And I began to slowly put trust in those things. And through that process, I had this thing called a spiritual awakening. And step 11 over the years for me has become just a well and a fountain of grace, even if it's done imperfectly, which it is in my case many, many times, almost always. I don't even know what a perfect prayer is, frankly. But I know this. I know that if I'm praying to a perfect God, he can take my imperfections and sort of translate them into his own perfection and understand what my heart is longing for, even if my words can't express it. He can take the need that I have in my heart and see it, even if I can't find ways to convey it. He knows me better than I know myself. There's an old line, that he knows the number of hairs on top of my head. Apparently God knows some subtraction over these last few years. He's taken a few off the top there. But my point is that this idea of this line on page 100 has become a great resource for me. And I don't have to do it perfectly, but it's a component of my prayer life that's really important. And so on page 99, you'll have to forgive, I've been fighting a cold for about 3 weeks. Doctor's finally given me some medicine, and hopefully this will bounce off me here in the next day or so. But as we approach this line, and it's a little bit of a different line, perhaps our trouble was not that we used our imagination. And like I said, I lived in my imagination. I lived in a fantasy world. It says perhaps the real trouble was our almost total inability to point imagination toward the right objective. There's nothing the matter with constructive imagination. All sound achievement rests upon it. And as we look at the 11-step prayer and the thoughts and the ideas and the tenets and the principles that go along with it, what I think Bill Wilson is asking us to do here is to slow down a little bit and to ask ourselves some questions in terms of its application, and then think about it, like really take some time and think about what this might look like in our lives. The idea of, Lord, make me a channel of thy peace. He asks us shortly thereafter, what's a channel? What do you think he means by that? And to just sit quietly and contemplate the reality of what does that mean? That God's love would work through me into the world to perhaps create a better world, even if it's only one person or one 5-minute period at a time, or one conversation that doesn't end in bickering, or one small moment or two of patience that maybe maybe the party that I'm having a conversation with doesn't have right now. Maybe I'm supposed to bring that. Right? That where there is hatred, I may bring love. Where there is hatred, I may bring love. What does that look like? I have a beautiful wife. Some of you know my wife. She's an amazing lady, right? And what I found that helps me have a successful marriage, in spite of me being in it, in spite of the challenges that come with everyday life, right, is for me to think about how my wife needs me to love her. What does she need from me? My wife is a person that communicates love in a way that I don't. The way I receive love versus the way that she receives love is just different. It doesn't mean I'm wrong. It doesn't mean she's wrong, but it does mean that if I'm constantly trying to give her love in ways I think she should just understand and receive it, instead of actually taking time to slow down and ask her and discuss with her what makes her happy, what do you like? What makes you feel whole and complete? How can I aid that? How can I bring that better? to your world. I'm gonna miss it because guys, I'm always living up here. I think what this principle is asking us to do isn't trash this idea that God has given us brains to use, as our big book says. But how do we use the brains he's given us? And so having an honest conversation with my wife and then praying for the power to carry out what she tells me to do, provided it's not, silly things or immoral things or things that take away my dignity, right? But how can I elevate her dignity? Where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness. Where can that manifest itself? As I walk through my day in the 10th step and I see selfishness and dishonesty and resentment and fear as these things crop up, where can I bring forgiveness to lower that tension in those dialogues with other people? Where can I lower my demand for justice that sometimes can rout me inside and cause a tremendous amount of tension in me? Where can I bring forgiveness to that? Where there is discord, I may bring harmony. And I used to imagine that what that meant was I wasn't supposed to have an opinion. I was supposed to agree with whatever you said and sort of become this doormat and allow all those things. And I don't think God is calling me to that either. But I don't think, in addition to that he's calling me to be a bull in a china shop. Even if I have, ready for this? Even if I have a right to, my rights. Where are my rights? What is justice? How unfair, right? I think there's a way that if I calm down and I ask God to inspire me and to talk to me, not that I'll hear an audible voice, at least not in my case. Maybe some of you have, I haven't. But what I sort of get is a sense of comfort toward a trajectory of behavior. So it sort of feels to me like what God encourages me to do through this process of the 11th step, it is to follow the principles that seem to be in his nature. Things like kindness, things like listening, things like gentleness, without being frail and weak. Some of the most courageous people I know, some of the strongest people I know are the gentlest people I know. They don't have to wrestle around to prove their point. They don't have to manipulate conversations to get me to agree with them. They're just themselves, and there's a great strength in that, whether or not they're agreed with or not. This idea of where there is error, that I may bring truth. And sort of imagining, trying to use constructive imagination as Bill prescribes here to do that. In my work, my job, I have one job. Now there's many tasks I have, but there's one job, and that's a very simple job. At the end of the month, the P&L statement, the bottom number needs to be black. I need to make money for the company, period. They don't care. I just have to. And so I have found this principle of sitting back and asking myself, God, how can I help my company make profits ethically? You know what's weird? It isn't about the product, always. It isn't about the pricing, always. You know what it's almost always about? Respecting the customer. Being responsible and respectful to my staff. Making sure that my vendors are paid on time so that there's a relationship that's built of trust. You see, these spiritual principles, which I used to think were sort of like, okay, I need to practice them so I don't drink. But then, here's the deal, guys. I got to get back to real life. It's really nice and flowery to talk about these things, but that's not reality at all, right? And that was incorrect imagination, because the truth is, as I have discovered, that's where God's kingdom actually is. In the midst of these virtues, in the midst of these principles, in the midst of these values that we try to emulate and try to live out in deeper ways, in more effective ways, even when we're poor at it, even when we make the mistakes, The idea that me making a mistake and failing at practicing these things, if I give that failure to God and I go to my friend or go to the person I've just failed and say, look, I'm sorry about that. How do I make this right? Let's figure this out together. I can't tell you the immense value that that experience of failure brings me. Right? That where there is despair, I may bring hope. That just smells a lot like the 12th step to me. Man, that just smells like the 12th step. I remember listening to this young lady on a cassette tape from about 1984 when I first came into Alcoholics Anonymous in 1991. My sponsor had given it to me. And she was from Toronto, and she was speaking at the Cornhusker. And that lady, through a cassette tape, gave me hope. She's on this call tonight, by the way, which also gives me hope. But the beautiful part about that is all she did, there was no lecture. There was no sense of pride in her voice. There was no sense of being superior to me because I struggled to stay sober and she had a strong foundation at this point. All she did was just honestly, frankly, tell me her story through this cassette. And I remember driving in my car, longing for what she had. I was in despair, and she brought me hope. That's amazing, right? That where there are shadows, I may bring light. When I imagine what that looks like, when I imagine what that's about, there's some things that come to my mind. One of the things that comes to my mind, and again, I'm not saying any of these are true. I'm just trying to use this principle of imagination directed toward a right purpose and a right end and how they can be helpful for us in the 11th step. So please don't interpret that this is something I'm saying that's right. It's just something that's been very effective for me in terms of a practice. And light, I think, has a lot to do with love and respect. And specifically, when I'm dealing with women in Alcoholics Anonymous, to make sure that I'm looking them in the eye, making sure that I'm treating them like they were my sister and not someone who can affirm me, and make sure that I get a little pat on the back and feed my ego a little bit, and making sure that all of my attributes are acknowledged in the right way, right? But to look at each other like brothers and sisters, right? And to not use each other, to not manipulate each other, right? But to treat each other with dignity and respect. And where there is sadness, I may bring joy. And when I contemplate that, when I think about what joy is, right? I think about my granddaughter. Her name is Grace. I have 3 grandchildren, Grace and Hank and Rose. And they're all fantastic. Every one of them are great. But Grace was our first one. And I remember before Hank and Rose joined our family, I remember just holding Grace in my arms and just looking at her and just being absolutely amazed at this person who couldn't communicate back to me at all. It sounds a lot like my prayer life, right? I mean, especially in those early days when I didn't know how to pray, I didn't know how to talk to God, I didn't know what to say, I didn't know what I could do to get his attention because I thought I needed to do that. I thought I needed to say it right so he would be impressed with what I said, so that he would genuflect to my request. I was so wrong. I think over time, as I've watched him love you, as I've seen his love in your life, I began to see his love in mine. When I saw him treat you with kindness, I began to think in my imagination that maybe that time things went well, maybe that was him treating me with kindness. Because I thought it was luck. I thought it was luck. And it wasn't luck. It was the kindness of God showing through. And without the power of the 11th step, I would have missed that. Without watching him love you, I think I would have missed that. And so as I held Grace and was kind of playing with her, I remember this welling up of this child did nothing to earn that in me. She did nothing. She was just present, and she was there, And she was so sweet and beautiful. And she just had that new baby smell. And she just sort of blew bubbles with her lips. She couldn't say anything. She was just there. And it was amazing, the joy I felt in my heart. And I'll never forget, I went on a 12-step later that evening and talked to some friends in the program about that 12-step and told them about grace. And they made the connection for me. They made the connection for me. Right? That somehow in that 12-step, the man who 12-stepped me, somehow when we 12-step and we're out in the world, we're sort of doing God's work in a way to not only help ourselves for sure, but also to help that person who's suffering, who maybe can only blow bubbles. Maybe they can't do very much, right? They can't find a bathroom, and they don't know where the coffee is, and they're unsure about what's in the big book, and they're afraid, like I was afraid, that if I said it wrong, you'd reject me. And so this idea of just sort of allowing the love that is in Alcoholics Anonymous to be passed through us onto these new people, it gives us a sense of joy. It gives us a sense of joy in the face of their sadness. And then, of course, this idea, right? It's that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted. My whole life was about being comforted. I mean, it just was, right? Whatever I could do to feel good. I was a lover of pleasure. I was a lover of pleasure. And I would do whatever I could to satiate whatever longing I had to get it fulfilled, to get it to feel better. And again, through the principles of his first 9 steps, and then trying to practice 10 and 11 regularly in my life, I discovered some things. And I discovered that when I serve you, I'm served. It's all I need. I didn't know I needed to serve you to be okay. I didn't know that I needed to treat you with respect to figure out what self-respect was. I didn't know that I needed to be kind to you in order to feel satisfied with my life. I didn't know that. And these take on innumerable, just an unlimited amount of applications. You know, in the 4th step in our big book, it says that we are in the world to play the role that he assigns. That is to say that God has certain roles in life for me to play. And when I think of them, the very first role that comes to my mind is husband. And then after that, father and grandfather, certainly AA sponsor, right? Sponsee as well, right? I have a sponsor and I'm sponsored by that sponsor, which is unique, but nonetheless true and fun. You know, and it's interesting when I think about how I can best fit into those roles, how I can bring the most of what was given to me in Alcoholics Anonymous to those roles. But I am good, man. I'm good. And I think that's where that idea of channel comes in. You know, I'm going to close with this thought, but when I came in, I lacked power. That's just 100% true. And I did everything I could to try to find some power. And sometimes they were bad mistakes, and sometimes they were good mistakes. They worked out well in spite of me. But the one thing that I discovered, right, was that if I can be the middle link in a chain of 3, I'm doing all right. If there's someone ahead of me pulling me closer to God who leads me, and if behind me there's people who have yet to come where I've come, that I can pull them forward and bring them into my experience so that maybe they can have a little bit more than they have right now. That flow just happens. That flow just happens. You know, St. Teresa of Avila does a lot of water analogies with God. And the first level she talks about is like in a well where you drop a bucket down and you have to just work so diligently to get the bucket up, and you're grinding, pulling this bucket up. And that's a lot of work when I first came in. Step 11 was a challenge for me. It was a chore. My imagination had warped and twisted my thinking about God so deeply and about myself so deeply. It was hard to let God love me. And the second analogy she uses after some spiritual growth is like a little stream. It just flows. And then later, as we continue to mature, this idea of just a gentle rain falling on us, you know? And I think when we talk about step 11, no matter where we're at in it, new in our journey, have been doing it for a long time, maybe decades, some of us. I think what matters is not necessarily where we've been and not necessarily who we could have been if we had done it better long term, but who we are right now. Can I stand in the grace of God and let it feed me for the sake of the man or the woman next to me? I think there's 3 rules in life, and I'll shut up here. The first is to do whatever I can to receive God's love. Receive as much of it, as deeply as I can. Receive all that I can of God's love. Rule 2 is give every bit of it away that I get. And rule 3 is to chronically repeat rules 1 and 2 over and over and over again for the rest of my life. God bless you all. Thank you for having me. Ali, thank you so much. God bless the good folks in Toronto. God bless you. Thank you.